Recording. So okay, we're double recording. So hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Balance and Body podcast.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. We're so excited.
I am really excited. I want to jump right into this episode because we're talking about one of our favorite labs, the GI map by Diagnostic Solutions. But before we do that, I want to hear, so if any of you guys follow Angelica on her other page, which is at what?
Functional Wellness Clinic.
There you go. Yeah, so you can check her out there just for her own private practice. I'm at 18 Diagnostics, spelt, not the numbers. But she actually just shared that she got into what I think is like such a typical um, just obstacle when it comes to conventional medicine. And I'm not poo-pooing on like conventional medicine. It definitely has its place. But why don't you tell them the story? Because I know you already shared it online. I would love to hear an update as to how you navigated that very common and sticky situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am actually due for a round of blood work. The last time I got blood work was back in my prep, and I want to say it was about maybe in September. So it was near the end of my prep. And so obviously when you get blood work near the end of your prep, when you're under extreme nutrient depletion and extreme stress and all those fun things, your hormones and your blood lab markers are not going to come back as great and as accurate as you want them to be. Um, and so I actually made an appointment with my doctor and I was on the phone with her and I was explaining that I really want to get some more routine blood work because now that I've had time to heal my hormones and heal my cortisol, I want to see where I'm at. And so, unfortunately, it's just so infuriating, but she really refused to run these labs for me. And so her reasoning was that prep and the stress of prep would not actually affect my hormones and it would not actually affect me. And so I actually explained on the phone my designations, what I do, and why I believe that this affects your hormones and everything. And she really didn't believe me. And so we actually had a little bit of an argument on the phone because I'm really advocating for getting blood work, doing my routine checkup, and she was very reluctant to give it to me. And at the end of the phone call, she decided to write me the requisitions, but she did say, I highly advise you not to do this. And I was just so infuriated and confused because I don't understand why A, what is the issue with just checking? B, why would they highly advise you not to do this? So at the end of the day, I'm just happy that she ended up giving it to me, but it is just so infuriating to have this experience with a doctor. And honestly, every single time I have had to run blood work, I have had this same conversation with my doctor. So it's just one of the reasons why I do what I do, because now I can look at my own labs, I can look at functional labs that I know are going to tell me the whole story instead of just a snapshot anyway. So, all in all, it was a crazy experience.
It's frustrating, and it's something that we hear from all of our clients. They often feel like, aside from the fact that their symptoms and their expression of their own health experience is being dismissed, some physicians, some practitioners do actually act like the gatekeepers to not just healing, but actually your own health data. Do keep in mind that whatever your labs reveal, that is your data. That's your own personal information. So for anybody to try and bar you from being able to access that, potentially uncover needs for treatment, some sort of protocol, healing, I actually think is so beyond. I think it borders on criminal, truly. I also don't understand the motivation behind it. So here in Canada, and Angelica and I are both in Canada, we have health coverage that allows us to actually get our blood work done through conventional practitioners with no cost. And so this is the other part that I don't understand. It's like, we pay through our tax system into this medical program that allows us to go and get things like blood work, routine blood work done. And so why tell a patient that they shouldn't have access to that when in fact our entire system is actually built around us having easy access to this sort of information. And so, yes, you're right. This is why you do what I do. It's why I do what I do. And it's why sometimes you do have to take matters into your own hands. One, advocate for yourself, which I recognize not every single patient is going to have the confidence to do. They're not necessarily going to have the audacity to do because they don't necessarily have the academic background to feel as though they can have these conversations with their practitioners. And so the alternative is, of course, going the functional medicine route and running your own tests and getting more than just, a 10 to 15-minute appointment where you're maybe reviewing, right? And actually being able to sit down with a practitioner and getting an hour to an hour and a half of a full and deep and comprehensive review of what all of your labs actually reveal, and then a plan to get better. So today we're actually going to be talking about one of those labs being the GI Map by Diagnostic Solutions. It is one of our absolute favorites. And in my own personal practice, there isn't a client that gets away without running one. And the reason is because this one looks at markers that are revealed from within the gut, which are in fact connected to all of the other systems in the body. I always say from, top to tail, and can really tell us so much about why we're feeling the way we're feeling, why our bodies are behaving the way they are, and what we can do moving forward to get better. So I love the GI map. There are many other tests like it. We're going to talk a little bit about why it is that we love the GI map by Diagnostic Solutions in particular. But if your practitioner is running a different type of gut test, stool test, that's okay. We're just going to tell you about our fave, right?
Yes, we love it so much. And I, as well, in my own personal practice, run this lab on every single client because it is so comprehensive. It's so in depth. It's honestly, in my opinion, the best lab that you could run. It's a total game changer. And so, what we really love about the GI map is most traditional tests will just tell you if something is present or not. However, the GI map goes a lot deeper than that. It actually gives you specific data on things like bacterial imbalances, yeast overgrowth, bacterial pathogens, and so many more markers. So it is such an overall amazing test, and it can go into symptoms such as overall GI symptoms, so bloating, gas, constipation, diarrhea, and not only that, but skin issues, metabolism issues, immune system issues, inflammation, digestion. So it is just such a fantastic lab.
And we're going to go through some of those markers today, and you'll get the opportunity to actually see that it isn't just about the symptoms of general sort of gut discomfort and dysbiosis, but also even things like hormones and how they're being metabolized and cleared from the body. We can look at things like SIBO, so small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, IBS, and IBD. There are lots of different conditions that can actually be revealed to us through this specific test as well. And as Angelica said, the GI map is unique in that it doesn't just speak on the presence of a certain, whether it's a parasite, yeast, bacteria, protozoa, worms, it actually is quantitative. So this is a quantitative PCR test. That is a term that a lot of us in Gen Pop learned just a few years ago when there was another test that everybody was taking. But it is highly sensitive, and rather than telling us sort of like in ratio, so the DNA of the organisms that we're looking at, what percentage of the total DNA is, present in our gut, it actually gives us an exact number. Now, I do want to caveat this by saying that if you were to take a GI map, and obviously this is cost prohibitive, so I don't know who would be doing this, but if you were to take a GI map, let's say every single day for 7 days, okay, so every day of the week, the reality is that your numbers would look different every single day. They shouldn't look so different. You shouldn't have any major outliers, but it is going to look slightly different every single day. So do know that, if you're running a GI map, whether you're doing that on your own, if you're able to actually access it, straight to consumer, or if you're working with a practitioner, do know that this only it implies certain information about your gut health and the rest of your body, and that in correlation with your entire story, your whole health history, all of your symptoms, and all of the other tests that you may be taking. That is what should actually direct traffic on your protocols, dietary changes you might be making, sleep changes you might be making, supplements that you might be taking. So, I love the specificity of the data that the GI map presents, but I never want to increase the stress load of a client or a patient and sort of have them put too much emphasis on the numbers specifically. So,
Yeah, I
and
totally agree.
and I do want to add, since we actually are, putting up like the warnings right now, that this, just know that on this podcast in general, every episode, whether we say it or not, this isn't actually direct medical advice. We're not your practitioners. And even if we are, this isn't your specific information. So please take all this with a grain of salt. Use it as generalized health education. But if you have any specific questions, always do take it back to your practitioner, whether it's us or your own doctors or another functional care worker that you might be working with. So that is all. Let's jump into this test specifically. I think it's a really fun one because while, yes, you are testing, we're testing obviously our subjects, our clients, our patients, we're not actually checking the DNA of the person that is being tested, but we're actually checking the DNA of the organisms that reside within the ecosystem of the gut. So I think that's an interesting one because it's your test, but it's actually speaking to all of the little critters that exist within our body that really do direct traffic on our health. It is a stool sample, so it's something that you can provide hopefully comfortably within the comfort of your own home. It's really should be easy to produce. It's always a funny one to talk about. And I will run through super quick how you actually take it. And I'm going to give a pro tip that is actually not in the instructions, but I think it's an important one and it can increase the likelihood of being able to get a more accurate result. So a stool sample, you would think, is homogeneous in its DNA from one end to the other. That actually isn't the case. And parasites in particular actually like to hide and burrow in different areas, and they're kind of sneaky in the way that they try and hide from us when testing. So when you produce your stool sample and you have to go through with it comes with the package actually comes with like a little sample cup, like a what are those called? What are the cups called? Is there a name for those?
I think they're just a sample cup.
It's like a sample cup. And when you open it up, it has almost like a little spoon, like a little scooper
Yeah.
attached to the top. And what you're supposed to do is move through the sample from one end to the other, taking out, scooping out specific amounts that you're going to then add to the sample cup to reach a certain line. You'll shake it, you'll send it. I would urge you, if possible, to take more samples. So kind of poke the stool as much as you can from one side to the other, again, so that you are more likely to capture a more just a greater totality of what exists within the sample. So anyhow, you take your sample at home, you put it in the little cup, you send it back in the prepaid FedEx, that's at least what we're using here, FedEx mailer, and it heads out to the lab where through this qPCR testing, they're actually able to give you a quantitative result on all of the things that Angelica mentioned. So again, bacteria, parasites, protozoa, which are just sort of single-celled parasites, worms, and all of these other things like Candida and H. pylori, which we've already talked a lot about on our page. Why don't we get into some of the specific markers that are so relevant to our female athletes specifically? Because I have personally found that on their labs, on their GI maps, we see a lot of the same markers out of range.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's not the most fun test to complete, but it is so, so worth it. And just before we jump into the specific markers, I just want to make one more point about the GI map is that when we're running tests, it's not always about finding the problems necessarily. It's about understanding why those problems are there.
Mhm.
And that's another reason I really love the GI map is because as I said before, it's not just if it's going to tell you if it's positive or negative, it's going to give you so many markers that are going to help us clinically correlate exactly what's going on and why. And that's so functional, right? We're looking holistically, functionally at the whole gut to see, okay, if there's a parasite, why is there a parasite? And that's where you have to start when you're treating any gut issue. So I just wanted to make that point before we jumped in there.
Yeah, no, it's a very valid point, and I would argue that it doesn't just pertain to the GI map or to working with deficiencies and weaknesses within the gut, but actually the entire system is we're not just looking from a diagnostic standpoint as to what is present or what is going on, but why it is happening in the first place. And so the more we talk about this, I'm sure we're going to get to the place of mucosal barrier and it's the weaknesses in within the mucosal barrier that actually explain why any of this exists. There was a, a reel that I saw yesterday. Another practitioner, I can't for the life of me remember her name. If I can, I don't know, we'll note it somewhere. She's fantastic. She talks a lot about Alzheimer's and type 3 diabetes. And she was talking about, she was building a plate and she was talking about Brazil nuts. And so I was in the comments and I had mentioned something about Brazil nuts and the selenium specifically from Brazil nuts because it's like such a high quantity, such a huge portion of selenium that you get from just like less than a handful of Brazil nuts that it can actually be really, again, take this with a grain of salt, but it can be protective against things like, believe it or not, Ebola. And somebody, kind of like clapped back at me and they're like, that's crazy. So you're telling me that Ebola, that people are like, walking around with hazmat suits to protect themselves from, that all they need to do is eat Brazil nuts. And so what I explained to him is that no, I'm not saying that, Brazil nuts are the cure to Ebola or that they give you some sort of like immunity to Ebola. That wasn't at all what I was saying, but what is true is that oftentimes we see that certain deficiencies allow us to be more vulnerable to certain pathogens in our environment. And it is actually that vulnerability that allows the exposure, some people's exposure to pathogens to proliferate and cause sickness within the body, whereas other people who don't have those deficiencies seem to be able to interact with the exact same pathogens and they are just fine. I'm convinced it's like something that all moms have too, because we can take care of all of our kids who are sick, be exposed to their sicknesses, and we come out of it totally okay. And so that's your whole sort of like, you know, germ versus terrain theory, right? Why am I telling you this? Why am I telling you this? Why am I telling you this? How did I even get to this point?
We were talking about why the GI map and other lab tests
Mucosal
have
barrier, the mucosal
yes,
barrier. And so we'll get to that point in the GI map where we get to the actual mucosal barrier. And it's the integrity of the mucosal barrier that is going to determine whether or not some of the pathogens that you actually find in your environment and even within your system do actually become problematic or not. And so that is something that we're going to be able to take a look at on this very test. So why don't we get into some of those markers? Do you want to start with, I don't know, giving us a little 101 on commensal keystones versus opportunistic? Because I know everyone knows that there are good and bad bacteria, but like, what does that even mean?
yeah, absolutely. So your bacterial balance between your commensal and your overgrowth, and explain in a second, but the bacterial balance between those two is so, so important. So, when we say your commensal bacteria, this is your good bacteria. We want these in adequate amounts. And so, within the commensal bacteria, this is actually where 80% of your immune system here is here. A lot of your thyroid hormones are converted here. Your happy neurotransmitters such as GABA, serotonin, dopamine are made here. Your skin is a direct reflection of this bacteria. So this particular bacteria is vital. Then we have what's called opportunistic slash overgrowth. And so this is bacteria we only want in small amounts. If there's more than a small amount, that means that there is an excess. And so, like I said, we really want to have balance between these two because if we do not, this can actually throw off a lot of the existing bacteria. And that is actually what can produce a lot of those symptoms like skin issues, bloating, the gas, the constipation, brain fog, I see is a huge one. And another huge thing with that, with the particular commensal keystone bacteria, is that bacteria is actually what protects us from having certain overgrowth, such as Salmonella, E. coli. So it's so vital that we make sure we have that balance.
And so we talked a little bit about this last week. What about, the sort of generalized probiotics that are supposed to feed the gut that we find on the market that are being suggested in a lot of our athletes' contest prep plans? Are they a good idea or are they a bad idea? Is more in this case?
Yeah, so when we talk about probiotics, it loops back to what we talked about with bioindividuality. Most people actually do not need certain strains of probiotics because every single time we run a GI map, clients come back with overgrowth. And more often than not, that's actually stemming from probiotics and those certain strains in the probiotic that they're taking that's giving them an overgrowth. So before I ever recommend a probiotic, I will always run a GI map to actually see what strains are needed and what strains are not needed so we don't have to face that issue of making things worse or making us more deficient.
And this is one of the reasons why I love the GI map so much, specifically when it relates to our athletes, because this is what is going to allow us to streamline their supplement protocol. We're going to be able to provide them with exactly what they need and none of the stuff that they don't, which doesn't necessarily have a neutral impact, right? So taking something that you don't need doesn't necessarily flush out of the body. Keep in mind that the ecosystem of the gut is it's a living population. And so, it's really no different than having open borders, right? And very weak immigration policies where tons of people who may or may not be appropriate for the existing population are able to filter in. This is what blindly taking probiotics can do. It can really endanger the existing population because it throws off ratios. And so that's the thing is it's not just that we need to have a certain amount of a keystone or a commensal bacteria. It has to be in appropriate ratio with the opportunistic bacterias or what people would call the bad bacterias. And I think it's kind of like with cortisol. Everybody thinks cortisol is so bad. It has its purpose. Bad bacteria does too. And so it's that balance that we're really trying to protect when we run these maps and then, recommend specific probiotic strains if need be. It's about that balance and that ratio. And that's always sort of top of mind for us when we're preparing protocols. Now, the other thing that we're going to be able to see, and this is really jumping down to the bottom of the test, and it's a very comprehensive, but actually very easy to understand test when you get the results. It's 4 or 5 pages, depending on how much information you order. So even if you were to look at it on your own, it does actually come with a glossary, and it's very, like I said, very simple to understand. But my favorite part of the test is down near the last page, and it takes us through a few intestinal and sort of immune markers that tell us a lot about how we're actually processing the food that we're eating. And as athletes, that is really a massive feature of our prep and our plans and our recovery is what we're eating, our proteins, our fats, our carbs. How are we actually digesting them, metabolizing them, assimilating them, or are we at all? And so there are a few markers, three that I know because I talk about them all the time, they're very exciting to me, are steatocrit, which measures our fecal fat. So fat, the presence of fat in our stool, that speaks to how well we're actually able to break it down. And again, it's not about what we eat, it's about what we absorb. The other one is elastase 1. And so that speaks to pancreatic sufficiency or insufficiency and the sort of enzymatic output that our body is capable of. Again, that comes down to breaking down of food, right? So when we're taking in a lot of protein, which as athletes we do and we need to for muscle protein synthesis, for recovery, for satiety levels, if we're not actually breaking that protein down and it's instead sitting and fermenting in the gut, that's going to cause a whole host of problems and symptoms. And so elastase 1 is one of those markers that tells us how efficiently we're actually doing that. And again, like I said, speaks to enzyme production and our pancreatic sufficiency. So although we're looking at the gut, we're actually looking at a lot of different organs that are directly connected to the gut and to our stool production. Beta glucuronidase, I think, did we cover that one? I feel like we might have mentioned it maybe in one of our reels. But beta glucuronidase is a very, very interesting marker. It is bacteria triggered. And when you have it in excess, what it really points to is an unbinding of toxins and hormones that are meant for exit from the body. When our liver, through bile, through the gut, is actually processing hormones out. So think, for instance, excess or even exogenous estrogens, it binds them. And it does the same with, some of its metabolites. And like I said, a lot of other toxins that are meant to leave our bodies. What beta-glucuronidase can do is actually unbind those perfectly bound packages, therefore sending all of those constituents back into general circulation, recycling them through the body. And this is where you can end up with an undesirable toxic load and also hormonal imbalance and potentially estrogen dominance. So beta-glucuronidase is a really interesting one. And so for, this one might be actually really relevant to you, obviously, because you dealt with estrogen issues. And so I'd actually be curious to know if at any point you actually saw beta-glucuronidase on your map. I saw it on mine.
I did see it on mine. Yeah, on the last GI map I did run, it was on mine. And so I actually really love this beta glucuronidase marker. And one thing I find in every single client who has this marker come back as high is it's not necessarily actual estrogen dominance. It's more so estrogen dominance like symptoms.
Yeah.
And so we have a particular bacteria in our gut that actually breaks down and metabolizes and gets rid of excess estrogen. And so this is where the beta glucuronidase comes into play because it detoxes this out of our gut. And so if this bacteria is not sufficient, it's not working as it should, it can give us estrogen dominance like symptoms. And yes, that is what I had, which was really interesting. So yeah, it's not so much that's actual estrogen symptoms from your estrogen being high. It's more so from this particular bacteria in your gut not being sufficient and beta glucuronidase not detoxing as it should. And so that's going to give you symptoms like PMS, bloating, painful periods, breast tenderness, water retention, all of that kind of stuff.
All things that are very, very relevant to athletes who are trying to bring their best body to stage. That definitely impacts the way that you feel throughout your workouts, throughout your day, how you're going to be recovering, how you're going to be sleeping. And when those things are dysregulated, obviously your prep is not going to go the way that you want it to go. So these are all really important markers to look at, and they can help us understand one, what we need to do with respect to just certain needs that aren't being met in the body, but also like what we really need to do to resolve these issues so that prep can just feel so much smoother. And last week we kept using the word predictable, but truly so that you can actually get predictable results from your protocol. A few other things that seem to come up on a lot of tests that can definitely speak to some of the dysbiotic symptoms that our athletes experience would be the presence of certain fungi like, you know what I'm going to say, Candida. Everyone's always talking about Candida.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one, and can help us better understand how to feed our athletes. We can say that, not all good foods are good for everyone. So definitely somebody, with Candida might need to stay away from something as simple as vinegars, right?
Yeah.
And right, when you're talking about a lot of like fermented foods and the vinegar like like a lot of the fermented foods do have a vinegar-like quality to them. And so while those can be extremely healing for the gut, when you have something like Candida, for instance, when that is actually present on a GI map, it's actually something you want to steer clear from. And this is why I'm saying that not all good foods are good for everyone. Biospecificity matters. The other big one that we often see is H. pylori and some of its virulence factors. I like to think of the virulence factors as kind of like getting extra guac, which I know can be a good thing for a lot of people, but it really kind of throws off, it ups the ante, I would say, on the overall profile of the meal. And so virulence factors are exactly that. They're the extra guac, the extra cheese, the extra something that really ups the ante on how destructive H. pylori can be in the body. H. pylori also has on this test, on this GI map, a not like a counterpart, but sort of like a cousin section where we're actually able to look at antibiotics, different antibiotics, and your potential resistance to them. Now, general practitioners do tend to go the route of antibiotics to deal with H. pylori, to eradicate it from the body. It's not how we tend to address infections, simply because antibiotics have a tendency to go in without discretion, without bias, and actually eradicate everything. And as Angelica explained at the top of the episode, we do need our both our good and our bad bacteria, and like I said, in very specific ratios. So to go in and just sort of, kind of carpet bomb the entire population doesn't actually end up doing us much good, because it is actually that bacterial population that gives us a lot of our immunity, to be able to contend with all of the other things that we're going to encounter even after eradication of something like H. pylori. So not to say that that isn't a route that you can go, but if you are going to go that route, one thing that the GI map does provide you with is just some titers on whether or not you are resistant to specific antibiotics. And, it's worth knowing, because obviously if you're going to go that route, you want it to be effective and you want it to work quickly for you. We tend to work with infections with things like botanicals and microbials, antimicrobials rather, and they're very effective. They work on the parts of the system that we want it to work on, and they leave the rest alone and intact. And they are extremely effective. So I personally had H. pylori when I ran so 2 GI maps ago, and I was able to heal from that, and so many of my symptoms were alleviated literally just by addressing that one issue alone. So my skin is, I mean, I don't want to tempt the devil here, but I'm going to say like perpetually clear. And when I had my H. pylori infection, it absolutely wasn't. If I was competing on stage, if I was appearing, at workshops, in magazines, that would have been something that would have made me feel highly insecure. Our skin health is important for a number of reasons, but just, from an aesthetic standpoint, having problematic skin that is screaming there's something wrong with the gut, can actually just make us feel so small, so scared to really put our best face forward, because that really isn't the best at all. I had so much cognitive just struggle that was predominantly due to my candida, because candida can really behave almost like an allergy in the body. It can feel like a very strong histamine reaction. And so yes, you might see things like, strange rashes, a lot of gut dysbiosis, gas, bloating, but also a lot of brain fog, confusion, poor memory. That was definitely something that I was dealing with. So just dealing with those two infections and overgrowth, just it really took the edge off of all of my symptoms, and I felt like I was able to actually, with a lot more vigor, go after everything else that was going on in my body. And sometimes, look, that's just kind of like the way that it has to go. We can't always deal with everything at once and as much as we'd like to. But I would say that something like H. pylori is definitely one of those that stands out as a priority to me. And the relief that you can get from effectively dealing with H. pylori. So from the standpoint of the mouth, because it is not just a gut infection, it's actually an oral infection as well. And then of course, treating anybody in the household who you might share saliva with, whether that be through cutlery, through cups, through kisses, whatever the case may be, because H. pylori is highly contagious. And so we often see family interfections. So dealing with anybody in the household or in your network who needs to be treated, can really get you on the right foot when it comes to dealing with anything else that might actually show up, whether it be on a GI map or any other test.
Yeah, H. pylori is extremely common, and I think it's one of those things that I know you mentioned this last podcast, but we think it's very rare and it's not super common, at least here. But due to how contagious it is and the common modes of transmission, it is honestly so prevalent here, a lot more than we would think. And so another marker that I really like is secretory IgA. And so what this tests is your gut's immune system. So remember how I said 80% of your immune system is in your good bacteria of your gut. So this is what it's testing. And so anytime we have, let's say, H. pylori, or we have candida, or we have a parasite, your immune system is actually going to be chronically activated because it is working hard to fight off these overgrowths. And so even if you're thinking like, hey, this doesn't make sense, I eat a good diet, I take good care of myself, but I'm constantly getting sick. I don't understand why my immune system seems to be so poor. Almost always it is because you have infections currently in your gut that your immune system is busy fighting off. And so I love looking at the secretory IgA. Another part to the secretory IgA that I like to see is it's highly correlated with stress. And so if somebody, a particular client is extremely stressed out, we're going to see that on that marker. And so that marker can come back in two ways. It can either come back as low, which I believe that when it comes back as low, it's a lot worse than when it comes back as high. And so when it comes back as low, what that's going to mean is that your gut has been dealing with these, whether it be the food sensitivities or the parasites or what I mentioned before, it's been dealing with it chronically for so long that your immune system is actually starting to slow down and it's becoming depleted. It cannot fight off things anymore. And when it's high, it's going to indicate that you have more of an acute infection. So, like I said, it's really great to see this marker and see how the overall gut is affecting it. And if you are getting sick frequently, if you're not, if your infections are lasting longer, it's all due to this marker.
And yeah, I agree with you. You're absolutely right that seeing a higher secretory IgA is preferable over seeing a low secretory IgA. To me, it's really no different than when, we look at cortisol. And so you can have somebody who's got a dysregulated cortisol pattern, but you can also see that the body still has the capacity to pump it out and respond to stress versus a client that actually has a flatlined cortisol pattern. And what that's telling us is that they have been living under chronic stress for an extended period of time to the point where their body can actually no longer, from an adrenal standpoint, respond to the stressors of their life. That's an exhaustive phase, and it is so much harder to bring somebody out of that. So if I can just warn everyone that if you are at a point where you feel like you're just running out of steam, take that seriously. There is actually a clinical marker, numerous clinical markers that can that correlate to that feeling of I just can't anymore. And we said it last time, you don't need to white knuckle the process, and this is definitely one of those areas where you don't, right? So it's not a matter of willing your way through. It really is so worth just running a diagnostic tool like this and seeing, does your body still have the capacity to deal with all of the stressors, whether they be relationship stressors, prep stressors, or actual infections that can be addressed in a really gentle and effective way. Another one that we see in that same section on the test is our anti-gliadin. And so going back to, the foods that we eat and how our body is actually processing and utilizing and assimilating those nutrients, anti-gliadin speaks to gluten. So you may not have, an inherent gluten sensitivity, but for whatever reason, you may actually have chosen to pull gluten or reduce gluten in the diet. And this is actually an interesting marker because I think you can almost use it as a check-in point to see how well you're actually navigating, potentially a low gluten diet. So there are a lot of people who don't understand how much cross-contamination there is in our food. A lot of us are just lacking food education. I say, back in school, they missed out on teaching us a few things, finances. That one, I think I didn't even go over everybody's head. I think they just kind of forgot to write that one into curriculum. Women's hormonal and reproductive health, they missed that one. And definitely nutrition. And even, unfortunately, in med school, it's not something that is front and center when it comes to curriculum, which is a shame because I think it's where all good health starts. But anti-gliadin is a very interesting marker that can speak to how your gut is responding to the presence of gluten, whether it's something that you should consider pulling out or reducing, and if you have done that, how well of a job you are doing with that. It's really easy to jump on dietary trends, low FODMAP, keto, gluten, dairy-free. But the reality is that not everybody actually needs to be on those very trending diets. And this is one of those markers that can, speak to what your body in particular is asking for.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I really like seeing where the gluten protein level is at because I don't ever recommend to exclude a food group, specifically gluten, for the rest of your life. Obviously, if you're celiac, that's a whole different story. But what I believe is that it's not usually what we think is gluten is the culprit. But honestly, 95% of the time, that is not the case. Gluten, however, it can be very inflammatory to our gut. And so when we're in the midst of healing, and let's say we run a GI map and our gluten protein marker comes back as high, if we continue eating gluten, it's kind of like throwing gas onto a fire. So it's not the culprit, but it's just going to create more inflammation and it's just going to worsen things for the time being. However, when you do a period of time where you remove it and you address all those underlying factors, you can absolutely incorporate gluten back into your diet eventually.
And now there are certain markers though that I would say are a silver bullet, and it's a run, don't walk situation that we would see on the GI map. So whereas antigliadin might not be one of those, something like occult blood is. Blood in the stool can be very serious. And so as functional health practitioners, that is not where we do our dance. And so when you do receive the results back for your GI map, whether it's, something like that, an H. pylori, presence on the GI map, you're always going to get a referral back to your primary care physician or any physician that you feel is appropriate to deal with this so that they can actually have some oversight and give you some more options when it comes to treatment. Because we do things our way, they do things their way, and ultimately you should always have the choice. Just like Angelica should absolutely be allowed to run her blood work whenever she wants to, and her doctor
Yeah.
should not stand in the way. Is there
No.
anything else you want to touch upon with this amazing GI map?
I think the last one of the things I did want to check or touch on is it's really, really important to make sure that you are treating based on what your concerns are and what your imbalances are. And one of the reasons being is, well, even when we're talking about secretory IgA, back that's your immune system. And so it really depends whether if that's going to come back as high or low. If you don't know and you're treating it, let's say for it to be high and it's actually low, in the end, you're going to make this worse. And I know from firsthand experience, due to my blood work and my estrogen issues, that when I thought it was low and it was actually really high, and I was treating it as it was low, I was increasing it and I made the problem so much worse in the end. So overall, it is just so vital to ensure that you know exactly what you need so you don't end up making the issue worse in the end.
Yeah, no more, taking shots in the dark. We're all, listen, we all want to get better as quickly as possible. We want to get back to feeling vital and robust. And especially, if you are in prep or even in your recovery season, you still might have your eye on certain show dates. And there really is no sense in just trying protocols on for size and going after potential issues that may or may not actually be present based on, your symptoms and like we said, what your friend, your coach, or maybe even like a training partner may have experienced themselves. So that specificity that you can get from something like a GI map, I think is just really invaluable. And again, as we explained to you, it doesn't just speak to what is going on in the gut, but actually what the gut has to do with a lot of the other symptoms that you could be experiencing, both upstream and, well, I guess there isn't really anything too far downstream from the gut, that you may not even have realized are related, like those skin issues, cognitive issues, hormone issues, joint inflammation, recovery issues can all absolutely be, related to the gut and revealed through the GI map. So if it's something that you are interested in running for yourself, you can definitely get in touch with us, either by email through our website, balanceandbodydiagnostics.ca, on Instagram at the same handle. And we would love to get you started. If you have recently run a GI map and you're just looking for a more thorough interpretation, it might be worth sending us a DM. We could definitely answer your questions if you have them.
Yeah, we can absolutely do that. Well, thank you so much for listening today. We will be back next Friday with our next lab that we are talking about. So we will chat then.
Okay. Have a good week, everyone. Bye.
Bye.